It wasn't nuclear codes or invasion plans that FBI agents were hunting for in the freezing winter of 1942. It was the sound of a kiss, huddled in a nondescript surveillance van on a gray Washington street. J. Edgar Hoover's men pressed headphones to their ears, recording every breath and whisper coming from a nearby hotel room. Inside that room lay a sickly 24-year-old naval officer named John F. Kennedy, the golden heir to an American dynasty, completely unaware that his passionate, secret affair was being weaponized to destroy his future before it even began. The woman in his arms was Inga Arvad, a beauty so striking she had once captivated Adolf Hitler himself, who famously declared her the perfect example of Nordic beauty. To the young JFK, she was the love of his life, the only person who saw the vulnerable boy behind the political mask. But to the United States government, she was suspect number one, a suspected Nazi spy whose embrace was considered an act of treason. This is the untold story of the romance that nearly strangled the Camelot legend in its crib, a tragedy of a woman who walked into the lion's den of history and found that love was the only crime for which there was no pardon. But the roots of this scandal lay far deeper than a DC hotel room. To find the truth, we cannot simply look at the politics of 1942. We must wind the clock back, away from the war-weary streets of America to a Europe that was dancing on the edge of a volcano. We must understand the woman before she became the suspect. We must understand the perfect beauty before she became the perfect target. Inga Marie Peterson was born in 1913 in Copenhagen, a city of spires and sea mist. From the moment she could walk, it was clear that she was not destined for an ordinary life. In the early 20th century, the path for a Danish girl was narrow and well lit. She was to be educated in domestic arts, find a respectable husband, and disappear into the quiet dignity of motherhood. Inga, however, burned with a different kind of fire. Her father was a man of culture, a theater lover, and Inga absorbed the dramatic arts like oxygen. She was a concert pianist of considerable talent, her fingers moving across the keys with a passion that hinted at the storm brewing inside her. But it was her face that would determine her fate. By the time she was a teenager, Inga Peterson was undeniably, breathtakingly beautiful. It was not just that she was blonde and blue-eyed. It was that she possessed a natural, effervescent charisma, a life force that people found intoxicating. In 1931, at the age of 17, she was crowned Miss Denmark. For most girls, this would have been the pinnacle, a nice story to tell grandchildren. For Inga, it was merely a key. She understood with a precocious and somewhat frightening clarity that her beauty was a currency, and she intended to spend it to buy her freedom. She refused to be a mannequin. She wanted to be a player in the great game of the world. She briefly married an Egyptian diplomat at 17, a rebellion against the staid Danish expectations. But the marriage dissolved as quickly as it had begun. She then traveled to Paris, the city of lights, where she studied at the Sorbonne. She was hungry for knowledge, for experience, for the proximity to power. She wanted to be a journalist. In the 1930s, journalism was a rough, male-dominated trade, a world of smoke-filled newsrooms and hard-drinking reporters. A former beauty queen was not supposed to be asking the hard questions, but Inga had a gift. She knew how to listen. She knew that powerful men, no matter how busy or important, possessed a fatal weakness, vanity. They wanted to be understood. They wanted to be admired. And when a woman who looked like Inga Arvad sat across from them, leaning in with intense blue eyes, asking them about their dreams and their visions, they didn't just talk, they confessed. By the mid-1930s, the center of the world's gravity was shifting violently. Paris was the city of the past. Berlin was the city of the future. The National Socialists had seized power in Germany, and a strange, terrifying, and mesmerizing energy was pulsing from the Reichstag. The world watched with a mix of horror and fascination as Germany, beaten and humiliated after the Great War, began to stand up, flex its muscles, and march. Inga, drawn like a moth to the brightest and most dangerous flame, moved to Berlin. It was 1935. The ovens were not yet burning. The yellow stars were not yet mandatory on every coat. It was the era of the Great Deception, where the Nazis were desperate to show the world that they were a civilized, cultured, and resurgent nation. They were preparing for the 1936 Olympics, a spectacle designed to showcase Aryan superiority and German efficiency. Inga arrived as a freelance correspondent for Danish newspapers. She was 22 years old, fearless, and dangerously naive. She navigated the cocktail parties of the Third Reich with the grace of a diplomat. She learned German quickly, absorbing the cadence and the rhetoric of the new order. She did not see the thugs beating shopkeepers in the alleyways. She saw the clean streets, the smiling youth organizations, the sense of national purpose that seemed to have replaced the chaos of the Weimar Republic. Her rise in Berlin was meteoric. She used her charm to climb the ladder of the Nazi hierarchy, securing interviews that seasoned male reporters could only dream of. She interviewed Hermann Göring, the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe. She sat with Joseph Goebbels, the limping, venomous minister of propaganda, who was known for his predatory behavior toward women. But Inga managed to handle them all. She was the inquiring photographer, a woman who could disarm monsters with a smile. And then she caught the eye of the man at the center of the storm. It happened at a reception. Adolf Hitler, the Führer, the man who held the fate of Europe in his hands, was not immune to the appeal of the Nordic ideal. When he was introduced to Inga Arvad, he was reportedly struck silent. Here, in flesh and blood, was the living embodiment of the racial fantasy he had been preaching to the masses. She was tall, she was blonde, she was strong, and she radiated health and vitality. Hitler invited her to his private box at the 1936 Olympics. This is the image that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The young, smiling Danish beauty, sitting just feet away from the dictator as Jesse Owens sprinted to glory on the track below. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment for eternity. To the world, it looked like an endorsement. To Inga, it felt like the scoop of the century. She was granted private interviews with Hitler, a privilege almost unheard of for a foreign journalist, let alone a woman. In these sessions, the mask of the dictator slipped. He did not scream speeches at her. He did not rant about the Treaty of Versailles. He played the role of the lonely visionary. He charmed her. And Inga, in a colossal failure of judgment that was born of youth and the intoxicating proximity to absolute power, was charmed back. She wrote articles back to Denmark that described him in glowing, almost romantic terms. She wrote of his kindly eyes. She described him not as a tyrant, but as a solitary man carrying the weight of a nation. "You immediately like him," she wrote. "He seems lonely. The eyes are kind-hearted." She saw the man he wanted her to see, not the monster he was. She did not understand that she was being used, that she was a prop in a propaganda masterstroke. She was the beautiful face of the Aryan future, a useful idiot who would tell the Scandinavian nations that Hitler was a man of peace. These articles were not secret. They were published, read, and archived. And years later, across the Atlantic, they would be translated by the FBI and placed in a file that would grow thicker with each passing day. But as the 1930s ground toward their bloody conclusion, the glamour of Berlin began to fade, revealing the rot underneath. The night of broken glass, the annexation of Austria, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the drums of war were beating too loudly to be ignored. Inga, who had married the Hungarian film director Paul Fayos in 1936, began to feel the walls closing in. She realized, perhaps too late, that the new Germany was a death cult. The men she had charmed were not misunderstood visionaries. They were architects of genocide. In 1939, she made the decision to flee. She left Europe behind, boarding a ship bound for the United States. She carried with her a few suitcases, a husband she was already growing distant from, and a reputation that was a ticking time bomb. She arrived in New York and then Washington, D.C., with the intention of reinventing herself. She wanted to be Inga Arvad, the American journalist. She wanted to leave the Nordic beauty of the Third Reich in the ashes of the Old World. She enrolled in the Columbia School of Journalism, seeking to legitimize her credentials. She was brilliant, she was hardworking, and she was still impossibly magnetic. By 1940, she'd made her way to the nation's capital. Washington, in the pre-war years, was a southern town trying to become a world city. It was a place of secrets, of ambition, and of nervous energy. Everyone knew war was coming. The only question was when. Inga found a home at the Washington Times-Herald. The paper was run by Sissy Patterson, a legendary, hard-drinking, chain-smoking doyen of the press who recognized a fellow survivor when she saw one. Patterson knew about Inga's past in Berlin. She didn't care. In fact, she loved it. Controversy sold papers. She hired Inga to write a column called "Did You Happen to See?", a feature that allowed Inga to do what she did best: interview the powerful men of Washington and extract their secrets. Inga Arvad became a sensation in D.C. society. She was the exotic Dane, the woman with the mysterious accent and the devastating smile. She interviewed senators, generals, and cabinet members. She was seen at the best parties. She was living the American dream. What she didn't know was that Hoover's FBI had been tracking her from the moment she set foot in Washington. They knew about the photos with Hitler. They knew about the Kindly Eyes articles. They suspected that her arrival in Washington was not a flight from tyranny, but a deployment. Was she a sleeper agent? Was she using her column as a cover to gather intelligence for Berlin? Hoover put her on the Custodial Detention Index, a list of people to be immediately arrested in the event of a national emergency. It was in this atmosphere of high tension and hidden surveillance that Inga's path crossed with the Kennedy family. She had heard of them, of course. Everyone had. Joseph P. Kennedy, the former ambassador to Great Britain, was one of the most powerful men in America. He was an isolationist who had famously predicted that democracy is finished in England. He was a man who treated his family like a corporation, with his sons as the primary assets. In late 1941, Inga's sister, who also lived in Washington, introduced her to a young naval officer. He was working in the Office of Naval Intelligence, a desk job secured by his father's influence. He was thin. His hair was an unruly mop of reddish brown, and he walked with a slight stiffness due to his bad back. He was not the Viking conqueror that Hitler had pretended to be, nor the bombastic egotist like Goering. He was witty, self-deprecating, and possessed a glittering, ironic intelligence that matched her own. John F. Kennedy was bored. He was frustrated with his desk job, frustrated with his health, and frustrated with the pressure of being a Kennedy. He felt like an observer in his own life, a young man waiting for a war that might kill him. And then he met Inga. The attraction was not a spark, it was an explosion. Inga was 4 years older than Jack. She was married. She was worldly. in a way the Catholic schoolboy from Boston could hardly comprehend. She taught him about wine, about food, about European history. She did not treat him like the ambassador's son. She treated him like a man. She saw the pain behind his eyes and the ambition he was trying to hide. For Jack, Inga was a revelation. She was Inga Binga, his escape from the suffocating expectations of his father. For Inga, Jack was honeysuckle, a breath of fresh air, a young man with a pure heart in a city of cynics. They began to see each other constantly. They dined at the best restaurants. They took long drives into the Virginia countryside. Jack, who had been raised to view women as conquests, found himself falling deeply, helplessly in love. While they laughed in dimly lit jazz booths, Hoover's men were already wiring phones, taking notes, and turning their romance into a future weapon against the Kennedys. But as they walked into that trap, the world around them was undergoing a terrifying metamorphosis. The naive optimism of peace had been shattered by the bombs at Pearl Harbor, and in its place a darker, colder reality was taking hold. The stage was no longer set for a romantic comedy of manners. It was now set for a war thriller, and the city they inhabited was about to turn against them with a vengeance. The winter of 1941 in Washington, D.C. was a season of frantic, desperate hedonism. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th had shattered the illusion of American safety, and the capital transformed overnight from a sleepy southern town into the nerve center of a global war. Blackout curtains were drawn across windows. Anti-aircraft guns appeared in public parks, and a feverish urgency gripped the population. Young men were shipping out to die, and young women were rushing to live before the lights went out. In the midst of this chaotic swirl, Ensign Jack Kennedy and Inga Arvad created a private island of intimacy, oblivious to the fact that their island was being mapped, mined, and targeted by the most powerful men in the country. Their relationship had moved beyond the casual flirtations of the cocktail circuit. It had deepened into something profound and, for Jack, entirely unprecedented. He was a young man who had been raised in a household where emotions were considered weaknesses, where vulnerability was a defect to be hidden under a layer of Irish charm and competitive grit. His father, the ambassador, had taught his sons to treat women as trophies, prizes to be won, enjoyed, and discarded on the march to power. But Inga refused to be a trophy. She was a woman of substance, a woman who had looked dictators in the eye, and she demanded to be met as an equal. In the quiet of her apartment at 1600 Massachusetts Avenue, or in the rented rooms of the Dorchester Hotel, Inga became Jack's sanctuary. He unburdened himself to her in ways he never could with his family. He spoke of the crushing weight of his father's expectations, the terrifying inevitability of his older brother Joe's political ascent, and the physical agony that was his constant companion. Jack's back was a ruin of congenital defects and football injuries. His stomach was a cauldron of ulcers and undiagnosed autoimmune issues. To the world, he was the vibrant, handsome scion of wealth. To Inga, he was a fragile, hurting boy who needed holding. She mothered him, she schooled him, and she loved him. She called him Honeysuckle, a nickname that was both playful and tender, stripping away the Kennedy armor to reveal the sweet, raw human underneath. But there was always a third presence in the room. J. Edgar Hoover had not been idle. The moment Pearl Harbor occurred, the status of every foreign national in Washington shifted from suspicious to potential enemy combatant. For Inga Arvad, the former guest of Adolf Hitler, the designation was catastrophic. The custodial detention index was activated. Hoover wanted her deported, or better yet, arrested. But he needed proof. He needed a smoking gun that linked the Danish beauty to the German intelligence apparatus. And when he discovered she was sleeping with a naval intelligence officer, the son of his nemesis, Joe Kennedy, he believed he had found the perfect nexus of espionage and treason. The surveillance operation launched against Inga Arvad was massive, intrusive, and unrelenting. It was a dragnet designed to catch a spy, but it ended up catching a romance. FBI agents, shivering in their heavy coats, trailed the couple everywhere. They documented every dinner at the colony, every late-night drive, every discreet entry into a hotel lobby, but the physical surveillance was just the beginning. Hoover authorized the installation of listening devices, bugs, in Inga's apartment and in the hotel rooms the couple frequented. The technology of 1942 was crude but effective. Microphones were hidden behind headboards, inside lamps, and under floorboards. The wires ran to adjacent rooms or parked vans, where agents sat with headphones, pencils poised, waiting for the betrayal of the nation. What they got instead was the intimate, banal, and heartbreaking soundtrack of a love affair. The transcripts of these tapes, preserved in the dusty archives of the FBI, paint a picture of voyeurism that borders on the obscene. The agents recorded the lovers gossiping about their friends, discussing the war news, and arguing about where to eat dinner. They recorded the rustle of sheets and the soft murmurs of affection. They recorded Jack complaining about his back pain and Inga soothing him. There was no exchange of naval codes. There were no whispers of submarine locations. There was only the sound of a 24-year-old man telling a woman, "You're the only person I've ever met who fits everything." Hoover was reportedly furious. He didn't want love sonnets. He wanted treason. He wanted Inga to ask Jack about the location of the Atlantic Fleet. He wanted Jack to slip up. The director of the FBI would read the summaries of these tapes with a cold, puritanical rage. To him, the affair was a moral failing that confirmed his suspicions about the Kennedy clan. They were reckless, immoral, and dangerous. The fact that Jack was working in the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, a position that gave him access to sensitive bulletins, made the situation technically untenable. A naval officer could not sleep with a suspected enemy agent. It was a court-martial offense. The tension in the surveillance van must have been palpable. The agents were listening to the son of one of America's most powerful men potentially commit treason with every kiss. But the betrayal never came. Inga, the supposed Nazi spy, seemed more interested in Jack's health than in his classified briefings. In fact, in a twist of irony that Hoover would never acknowledge, the tapes reveal that Inga was often the one bolstering Jack's patriotism, encouraging him to find his place in the war effort. But secrets in Washington are like water. They inevitably find the cracks and leak out. The rumors began to swirl. The gossip columnist Walter Winchell, a man who functioned as Hoover's unofficial mouthpiece in the press, began dropping blind items in his nationally syndicated column. He hinted at a scandal involving a young naval ensign and a beautiful female spy. The circle was closing. The news eventually reached the one man who could stop it, Joseph P. Kennedy. The patriarch was a man who viewed his family as a dynasty, a geopolitical force that would rule America for generations. He had meticulously crafted the image of the Kennedys: Catholic, patriotic, wholesome, and invincible. His eldest son, Joe Jr., was the designated heir, the future president. Jack was the charming support player. A scandal of this magnitude, a Kennedy son caught in bed with a Nazi spy while the country was at war, would not just ruin Jack's career, it would detonate the entire family's future. It would validate every accusation of anti-Semitism and fascism that had dogged Joe Sr. since his disastrous tenure as ambassador to London. The confrontation between father and son is not recorded on any FBI tape, but we can imagine the seismic force of it. Joe Kennedy was not a man who asked. He commanded. He would have laid out the reality to Jack with brutal clarity. You are playing with fire. You are sleeping with the enemy. Hoover has the tapes. End it, or I will end it for you. Jack, for the first time in his life, tried to fight back. He was in love. He believed in Inga. He believed with the naive certainty of youth that their love could transcend the war, the politics, and the FBI. He told friends that he wanted to marry her. He was willing to give up his commission, his inheritance, perhaps even his name, to be with her. It was a moment of rebellion that terrified his father. But Joe Kennedy did not become a multimillionaire and a kingmaker by letting sentimentality stand in his way. He went over Jack's head. He reached out to his contacts at the highest levels of the Navy Department. He called in favors. He pulled strings. In January 1942, the hammer dropped. Ensign John F. Kennedy received new orders. They were immediate and non-negotiable. He was being transferred out of the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. He was to report immediately to the 6th Naval District in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a banishment. He was being sent to a sleepy backwater, far from the war room, far from the press, and, most importantly, 500 miles away from Inga Arvad. The night before he left, the lovers met one last time. The FBI agents were watching, of course. They noted the tearful farewell. They noted the desperation. But they also noted that the affair did not end. It merely changed geography. Charleston was a purgatory for Jack. He was assigned to a dull desk job, tracking merchant shipping in the Atlantic, work that felt meaningless compared to the global conflagration. He lived in a dreary boarding house, his back pain flaring in the damp southern winter. He was lonely, bored, and heartbroken, and he was angry. He knew deep down that his father had orchestrated the transfer. He knew he was being managed. But love, or obsession, makes people reckless. Instead of letting the affair wither, the distance only fueled it. Jack and Inga began a frantic, high-risk correspondence. They wrote to each other daily. Jack's letters from this period are a revelation. They are not the polished prose of the future author of Profiles in Courage. They are the raw, unedited cries of a young man in pain. He wrote of his emptiness. "It's a funny thing," he wrote, "I haven't a damn thing to do. I'd rather be with you than anyone else in the world." The FBI intercepted every single letter. Before Inga ever held the paper in her hands, an agent had steamed open the envelope, photographed the contents, and placed a copy in the file labeled Arvad NGA. Hoover was reading their love letters before they were. He was building a dossier of indiscretion that would sit in his vault like a loaded gun for the next 20 years. The letters were not enough for Jack. He began to take dangerous risks. On weekends, he would slip away from his post in Charleston. He would board a train or a plane, traveling under assumed names, meeting Inga in hotels in New York, Washington, or even bringing her down to Charleston. They registered as Mr. and Mrs. K or used other flimsy aliases. They thought they were outsmarting the system, but the FBI was there every time, just out of sight. They were wrong. The FBI was always there. When Inga took the train south to visit him, agents were on the train, sitting a few rows back, hidden behind newspapers. When they checked into the Francis Marion Hotel in Charleston, the room next door was already occupied by men with recording equipment. The transcripts from the Charleston trysts are even more poignant. They show a couple trying to pretend that the world isn't closing in on them. They talk about the future, a future that everyone else knew was impossible. Inga, with her older, darker wisdom, seemed to sense the end was coming. She would often try to push Jack away, telling him that she was bad for him, that she would ruin him. "I am poison to you, honeysuckle," she would say. Jack would fiercely deny it, clinging to her with the stubbornness of a man who has nothing else to call his own. But the pressure was relentless. In Washington, the chatter was getting louder. The naval intelligence officers were nervous. Hoover was making noise about pressing charges. Joe Kennedy was apoplectic that the transfer hadn't worked. The Inga problem had not been solved, it had merely been relocated. It became clear to the Kennedy patriarch that a desk job in Charleston wasn't enough to separate his son from the Nazi spy. He needed something more absolute. He needed an ocean. He needed a war zone. Joe Kennedy began to lobby for a new assignment for Jack. Not a safe desk job this time, but a combat command. He would send his sickly, fragile son into the cauldron of the Pacific Theater. It was a cold calculation. Better for Jack to risk death in battle and return a hero than to stay in America and be destroyed by a scandal. The uniform would cleanse him. The war would make him a man, or it would kill him. Either way, the stain of Inga Arvad would be washed away. For Inga, the walls were closing in from a different direction. The FBI scrutiny was making her life unlivable. Her neighbors were questioned. Her employers at the newspaper were harassed. She realized that as long as she was connected to Jack Kennedy, she would be hunted. She was not just fighting for her love, she was fighting for her survival in a country that viewed her as a monster. As the spring of 1942 turned to summer, the couple stood at a precipice. They had defied the FBI, the Navy, and the Kennedy dynasty, but they were running out of room to run. The Golden Boy was about to be shipped to the Solomon Islands, to a destiny involving a PT boat and a Japanese destroyer. And the Nordic Beauty was about to be left behind, alone in a country that hated her, with nothing but a stack of open letters, and the memory of a love that had almost cost a president his future. With the stakes now raised to the level of national survival, the tolerance for a wayward son's romance had evaporated. The powers that be, the father, the director, and the Navy, decided that the time for warnings was over. They would not wait for the affair to die a natural death. They would kill it. And to do that, they needed to perform a surgical extraction, removing Jack Kennedy from the one place where his heart felt at home. The end of the affair did not come with a bang, nor with a dramatic confrontation under the streetlights of Charleston. It came with the quiet, crushing inevitability of a tide going out. By the late summer of 1942, the machinery of the Kennedy dynasty and the relentless pressure of the United States government had finally achieved what they set out to do. They had made the love between John F. Kennedy and Inga Arvad logistically impossible. The separation was engineered with military precision. Jack was not just transferred, he was removed from the board entirely. His new orders sent him to the Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School in Chicago for a brief face-saving interval, and then, inevitably, to the Melville PT Boat Training Center in Rhode Island. He was being weaponized. The sickly romantic boy who had quoted poetry in hotel rooms was being forged into a warrior, a commander of the Mosquito Fleet, destined for the brutal sun-bleached theater of the South Pacific. For Inga, this period was a slow-motion execution of the heart. She remained in Washington, then drifted untethered in a country that viewed her with deepening suspicion. The letters continued for a time, flying back and forth like desperate birds trying to cross a storm. In these final missives, we see the agonizing transition from lovers to pen pals, from a shared future to a remembered past. Jack wrote to her of his training, of the cold wind on the water, of the strange monastic life of men preparing to kill. But the intimacy was being strangled by the knowledge that every word was being read by strangers. They developed a code, a way of speaking around the truth, but the silence between the lines grew louder. In one heartbreaking letter, Jack acknowledged the forces arrayed against them. He wrote of his father's interference, of the gossip that had poisoned their well. He was beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, that he did not own his own life. He belonged to the clan, to the ambition, to the future. Inga was the beautiful anomaly, the road not taken. "The things I am doing now," he wrote, "are the things I have to do." It was a surrender. He was choosing the path of power over the path of passion. When Jack finally shipped out to the Solomon Islands in early 1943 to take command of PT-109, the physical severing was complete. He was now half a world away, living in a landscape of malaria, Japanese destroyers, and sudden death. The Inga Binga chapter was officially closed for Ensign Kennedy. He was busy becoming a hero. But for Inga Arvad, there was no Pacific theater to escape to. She was left behind in the pressure cooker of the home front, carrying the invisible scarlet letter of a Nazi spy. The FBI did not pack up their surveillance vans just because Jack Kennedy had left town. If anything, Hoover's obsession deepened. He now had the leverage he wanted over the Kennedy family, but he was still convinced Inga was a dangerous operative. The surveillance continued, her phone tapped, her mail opened, her friends questioned. She found herself in a Kafkaesque nightmare. She was a journalist who could not write without her work being scrutinized for coded messages. She was a socialite who was suddenly radioactive at dinner parties. The whispers followed her. That's the woman, the one who knew Hitler, the one who seduced the ambassador's son. She was trapped in the amber of her past mistakes. In a desperate bid to reinvent herself yet again, to outrun the shadow of Berlin and the ghost of Jack Kennedy, Inga looked west. If Washington was the city of power, Hollywood was the city of illusions, a place where people went to become someone else. She moved to California. She tried to find work as a screenwriter, to use her storytelling gifts in a town that didn't care about politics, only box office receipts. It was there, in the glittering artificial sunlight of Los Angeles, that she met Niels Astor, a Swedish actor, and later the man who would become her third husband, Tim McCoy. McCoy was a star of westerns, a cowboy hero of the silent era and early talkies. He was older, rugged, and definitively American. He was the antithesis of the European intellectuals and politicians Inga had known. He represented the frontier, the simple moral code of the white hat versus the black hat. Marrying a cowboy was in many ways Inga's final attempt to camouflage herself. By becoming Mrs. Tim McCoy, she was trying to weave herself into the fabric of American mythology. She wanted to be the ranch wife, the mother, the woman of the soil. She wanted to be boring. She wanted the FBI to look at her file and see nothing but domesticity. But the past is a stubborn thing. While Inga was trying to disappear into the California sunset, Jack Kennedy was being resurrected. In August 1943, in the dark waters of Blackett Strait, a Japanese destroyer sliced the PT-109 in half. Jack's actions in the aftermath, swimming for miles with the strap of a life jacket clenched in his teeth, towing a wounded crewman, were genuinely heroic. But they were also the raw material for the legend his father needed. When the news of Jack's survival and heroism reached the States, the Kennedy machine went into overdrive. They weren't just welcoming home a son, they were launching a candidate. The sickly playboy was gone. The war hero had arrived. The narrative was polished until it gleamed. And in that perfect, shining story of American heroism, there was absolutely no room for a Danish mistress with a swastika in her background. Jack returned to the United States in 1944, gaunt, yellow with malaria, and in constant pain, but draped in glory. He was now the heir apparent. His older brother, Joe Jr., The designated prince had been killed in a plane explosion over the English Channel, a tragedy that devastated the family, but locked Jack into a destiny he could no longer escape. He had to take Joe's place. He had to run for Congress. He had to be the vessel for the ambitions. Did he try to see Inga? The records are murky, filled with the smoke of hearsay. Some biographers suggest a final secret meeting, a closure that was denied them by the war. Others say he avoided her, knowing that a single photograph, a single sighting, could derail his run for Congress before it began. What we do know is that the emotional tether was never truly cut. Jack continued to ask about her. He kept tabs on her life. And Inga, from her exile in the West, watched his rise with a complex mixture of pride and heartbreak. She saw his face on magazine covers. She read the articles that described him as the most eligible bachelor in America. She saw him stepping out with debutantes and actresses, safe American women with unblemished pedigrees. She knew with a bitter clarity that she had been the great love of his life, the one who had awakened his soul, and yet she was the one woman he could never acknowledge. The tragedy of Inga Arvad in the post-war years is the tragedy of silence. She possessed one of the most explosive secrets in American political history. She could have sold her story. She could have destroyed his congressional bid in 1946, or his Senate run in 1952. She could have embarrassed the Kennedy family and humiliated J. Edgar Hoover, but she didn't. She kept the secrets. She protected the man she loved, even as he ascended to a height where she could not touch him. Hoover never let the Kennedys forget what he had. The Arvad file, tapes, transcripts, and old photos became his quiet leverage, the reason no one in the family ever truly dared to move against him. Inga Arvad, without ever lifting a finger, had become the lock on the cage that held the Kennedys captive to the FBI. In 1953, the final door slammed shut. Jack married Jacqueline Bouvier. The wedding was the social event of the season, a coronation in all but name. Jackie was perfect, young, Catholic, aristocratic, and French educated. She was the approved version of Inga, sophisticated and cultured, but without the baggage. Some who knew Jack well noted the resemblance. They saw in Jackie the same wit, the same distance, the same sharp intelligence that had drawn him to Inga. He was marrying an echo. Inga read about the wedding in the papers. She was now raising 2 sons with Tim McCoy, living a life of rodeos and ranching. She had become an American citizen in 1946, a moment of profound relief. But she was still, in the eyes of the government, a person of interest. As the 1950s rolled on, Inga Arvad faded from the public consciousness. She became a trivia question, a footnote. But inside her the memories burned. She watched the rise of Camelot with a unique perspective. When she saw JFK on television charming the press, she didn't see the president. She saw the boy with the bad back who needed her to tie his shoes. She saw the vulnerability he hid from the world, and she knew that he knew. She knew that in the quiet moments of the presidency, in the loneliness of the Oval Office, his mind would drift back to 1942, to the only time in his life he had been truly free. He reportedly told a friend years later, "I was happiest with her." It was a confession of a life lived for others, a life where duty had cannibalized joy. But the story was not over. The past has a way of circling back. As JFK entered the White House, the Inga Binga tape sat in Hoover's safe, a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. And Inga, living her quiet life in the desert, began to realize that she would never truly be free of the man she loved. She was destined to be the ghost at the banquet, the invisible woman whose existence challenged the myth of the perfect president. She had survived Hitler. She had survived Hoover. But she was about to face the hardest test of all, watching the man she loved be consumed by the history she had helped launch him into, while she remained trapped in the silence of the shadows. That silence would stretch across a decade, a heavy blanket of secrecy that covered the rise of a political sun. While Inga retreated into the quiet anonymity of the West, the machinery of history ground forward, polishing the Kennedy myth until it shone so brightly that it blinded the world to the shadows behind it. But even the brightest lights cast a shadow, and on a freezing day in the nation's capital, that shadow would stretch all the way to the steps of the Capitol building. January 20th, 1961. A cold, brilliant wind swept across the Capitol Plaza in Washington, D.C., whipping the flags and stinging the cheeks of the thousands gathered to witness the coronation of a new American king. John F. Kennedy, 43 years old, tanned, hatless, and radiating a vigor that belied his broken body, stood at the podium. He spoke of a new frontier, of torches being passed to a new generation. Beside him sat his wife, Jacqueline, the epitome of regal elegance in her fawn coat and pillbox hat. To the world, this was the dawn of a golden age. It was the triumph of youth, style, and promise. But 3,000 miles away in a quiet ranch house in the dust and heat of the American West, a woman watched the flickering black and white images on a television set, and she saw something the cameras missed. Inga Arvad, now Inga McCoy, sat in the dim light of her living room, witnessing the apotheosis of the boy she had called Honeysuckle. She saw the way he gripped the sides of the podium, not just for emphasis, she knew, but to steady a back that was likely screaming in agony. She saw the shadow of the pain she used to massage away in the dark of the Dorchester Hotel. And she saw the ghost of the young naval officer who had once told her he would give it all up, the power, the legacy, the presidency, just to be with her. The ascent of JFK to the White House was the ultimate victory for the Kennedy machine. But for Inga, it was a peculiar form of haunting. She had successfully reinvented herself. She was a mother now, raising two sons, Ronald and Terrence. She was the wife of Tim McCoy, a man of the West, a figure of leather and horses who was as solid and uncomplicated as the earth itself. She had traded the intrigue of Berlin and the salons of Washington for the vast, silent skies of California and Arizona. She grew roses. She attended school plays. She had, to all outside appearances, become an ordinary American housewife. But the past is not a place you leave. It is a place you carry. As Jack Kennedy moved into the Oval Office, the Arvad file did not vanish into the archives. It moved into the center of the executive branch's darkest power struggle. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, remained the most dangerous man in Washington, and Inga Arvad was still his ace in the hole. President Kennedy and his brother Attorney General Robert Kennedy despised Hoover. They viewed him as a relic, a tyrant, and a threat to civil liberties. They wanted him gone. They discussed firing him, forcing him into retirement, replacing him with someone loyal to the new frontier, but they couldn't. Every time they talked about firing Hoover, the same shadow rose, his secret files. He knew about the women, the mob, and most dangerously, about the Nazi spy from Jack's past. Hoover made sure the president knew that he knew. He knew about the women. He knew about the mob connections. And most damningly, he knew about the Nazi spy. If Hoover were fired, the unspoken threat hung in the air like mustard gas. The tapes would leak. The photos would surface. The transcripts of Ensign Kennedy and Inga Arvad in the hotel room. The love letters intercepted by the FBI. The connection to Hitler. It would all be spilled onto the front pages of every newspaper in the world. The scandal would not just impeach a president, it would destroy a legend. So Jack Kennedy, the most powerful man on earth, was held hostage by the memory of his love for Inga Arvad. She was the invisible chain that bound the president to the director. For Inga, this period was a surreal existence of silence. She saw her name whispered in books and articles, often as a footnote, a rumor. She saw the faces of men she had known, friends, enemies, lovers, shaping the fate of the world. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, as the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation, Inga must have felt a chilling familiarity. She had seen this brinksmanship before, in the eyes of the men in Berlin. Now, the man holding the trigger was the same man who had once written her letters about his loneliness and his fear of the future. She knew his mind better than his advisors did. She knew his capacity for detachment, his fatalism. While the world prayed, she likely remembered the young man who believed he was destined to die young. There were rumors, never substantiated but persistent, that Jack tried to reach out. Some biographers suggest that intermediaries were sent, that phone calls were made to unlisted numbers in the West. It is said that Jack, trapped in the gilded cage of the White House, surrounded by sycophants and Secret Service agents, yearned for the one woman who had ever really known him. He had other mistresses in the White House, Judith Exner, Mary Pinchot Meyer, interns, but they were distractions, fleeting comforts. Inga had been a soulmate, but any contact was impossible. The risk was too great. The FBI wiretaps might have been gone from her home, but the eyes of the state were never truly closed. And so, they lived in parallel worlds, connected only by the invisible thread of a shared history. Jack, the leader of the free world fighting the Cold War. Inga, the ranch wife, fighting the weeds in her garden and the memories in her head. Then came November 22nd, 1963. It was a Friday. Inga was 50 years old. The news broke in the middle of the day, tearing through the fabric of American life like a physical blow. Shots fired in Dallas. The president has been hit. When the confirmation came that John F. Kennedy was dead, his head shattered by an assassin's bullet, the world wept. It was a collective public grief, a global mourning for the loss of youth and hope. But in a home in the American West, the grief was singular, private, and devastating. For Inga, the news was not just the death of a president. It was the death of Honeysuckle, the boy she had protected, the boy she had sent away to war so he could become a hero, the boy who had promised to love her forever. He was gone. The finality of it was crushing. All the years of silence, all the sacrifices, all the secrets kept to protect his future, it had all ended in a convertible in Texas. She could not mourn him publicly. She could not fly to Washington for the funeral. She could not stand with the widow and the family. She was the secret. If she had appeared, the press would have descended. The old stories would have been dredged up, and the dignity of his death would have been tarnished by the scandal of his life. So she did what she had always done. She swallowed the pain. She grieved in the shadows. She watched the funeral on television, just as she had watched the inauguration. She saw the riderless horse, the boots reversed in the stirrups. She saw the little boy, John Jr., saluting his father's casket. She saw the eternal flame being lit at Arlington. And she must have wondered if any of it would have happened if they had just stayed in that hotel room in 1942, if he had resigned his commission, if they had run away together. He might not have been president. He might not have been a legend, but he might have been alive. He might have been an ordinary man with a bad back and a sharp wit, growing old beside her. The death of JFK released Inga from the immediate threat of exposure, but it locked her forever in the role of the tragic muse. The FBI files were no longer leverage against a sitting president. They were now historical artifacts, secrets of the dead. But Hoover, vindictive to the last, did not destroy them. He kept them. He knew that history would one day come looking for the truth about Camelot, and he wanted to make sure his version of the story, the version where the Kennedys were flawed, reckless, and compromised, survived. In the years that followed the assassination, Inga Arvad began to fade physically, as if the vitality that had defined her life was slowly draining away. The Nordic radiance that had captivated Hitler and Kennedy softened into the quiet dignity of a woman who had seen too much. She stayed with Tim McCoy, living a nomadic life that took them from estate to estate, but friends noticed a sadness in her, a distant look in those famous blue eyes. She never wrote a memoir. She never gave an interview about Jack. In the 1960s and 70s, as the Kennedy industry exploded and former aides and mistresses began to cash in with tell-all books, Inga remained silent. Offers came. Publishers waved checkbooks that could have set her up for life. She turned them all down. Her silence was her final gift to him. It was an act of loyalty that transcended death. She refused to be the one who tore down the statue. She refused to let the world reduce their love to a sordid spy novel. But the irony of her life was inescapable. She had spent her youth being defined by men, by her father, by Hitler, by her husbands, by Jack. She had been the perfect beauty, the Nazi spy, the mistress. She had fought so hard to be Inga Arvad, the journalist, the thinker, the individual. But history had trapped her in the reflections of the powerful men she had stood beside. In the late 1960s, the cancer came. It was aggressive, a thief that stole her strength and her beauty. As she lay dying in 1973, in a quiet room far from the centers of power, the world had changed. The idealism of the Kennedy years had curdled into the cynicism of Vietnam and Watergate. The heroes were fallen. The secrets were beginning to leak out. Inga faced her in with the same stoic resolve she had shown in the interrogation rooms of the FBI. She did not fear death. She had already lived through the death of her world multiple times. She had seen the destruction of old Europe. She had seen the destruction of her reputation. She had seen the destruction of her lover. When she died in December 1973, at the age of 60, the obituaries were brief. They mentioned her beauty pageants. They mentioned her marriage to the cowboy star Tim McCoy, but inevitably, in the final paragraphs, the names appeared. Adolf Hitler, John F. Kennedy. Even in death, she could not escape them. She was the hyphen between the monster and the martyr. But the files, those thousands of pages of typed reports, wiretap transcripts, and stolen letters, sitting in the dark of the FBI archives, tell a different story than the obituaries. They do not tell the story of a spy. They tell the story of a woman who is vast, complex, and profoundly human. They tell the story of a love that was strong enough to terrify the United States government. The story of Inga Arvad is not just a footnote in the biography of JFK. It is a tragedy of timing. She was a modern woman born into a world of archaic rules. She was a cosmopolitan soul in an age of nationalism. She was a woman who dared to believe that love could conquer history, only to find that history is a tank that rolls over everything in its path. As we look back at the tapes, at the grainy photos of a young naval officer and a smiling blonde woman, we are left with the haunting sense of what might have been, in a parallel universe where the FBI did not listen, where the ambassador did not interfere, where the war did not demand heroes. There is a quiet house somewhere. In that house, an old man with a bad back is reading a book, and an old woman with blue eyes is pouring tea. They are nobody. They are happy. But that is not the story we got. We got the legend. We got the tragedy. We got the ghost. But ghosts do not simply vanish when the bodies are buried. While the players left the stage one by one, the president to Arlington, the beauty queen to the desert, the script remained. It lay dormant in the steel cabinets of a government building, a paper trail of a love affair that had been criminalized by the state, waiting for the lock to rust and the truth to finally be set free. The grave of Inga Arvad is quiet. There is no eternal flame, no constant procession of tourists, no marble monuments inscribed with the weight of history. She rests in a simple plot, under the vast indifferent sky of the American West, a final resting place that offers the anonymity she craved, but was denied for so much of her life. But while her body was committed to the earth in 1973, the truth of her existence remained imprisoned in a very different kind of tomb. It lay in the sub-basement of the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., buried inside a thick, dust-covered dossier stamped with the code 100-12657. For decades, the Arvad file was a legend among the whispers of the intelligence community. It was the sword of Damocles that Hoover had hung over the Kennedy dynasty, a collection of 1,200 pages of surveillance logs, stolen letters, wiretap transcripts, and agents' reports. As long as Hoover was alive, the file was a weapon. It was the insurance policy that kept the director in power, the silent threat that ensured no Kennedy could ever truly move against the FBI. But in 1972, the old tyrant finally died. And in the years that followed, as the post-Watergate era ushered in a new hunger for transparency, the vaults began to crack open. When the Freedom of Information Act finally pried the lid off the Arvad file in the late 1970s and early 80s, historians and journalists descended upon it like vultures. They were looking for the smoking gun. They were looking for the proof that the beautiful Danish beauty queen had been slipping naval codes to the Luftwaffe. They were looking for the betrayal that would justify the destruction of a romance and the persecution of a woman. What they found instead was a tragedy documented in bureaucratic triplicate. The files revealed the staggering, paranoid waste of the American security state. There was not a single page, not a single sentence that linked Inga Arvad to espionage. There were no secret meetings with U-boat commanders. There were no microfilms hidden in hollow coins. Instead, the agents of the FBI had meticulously recorded a woman who was guilty only of being interesting, intelligent, and foreign. They had recorded her buying groceries. They had recorded her worrying about her son. They had recorded her crying over Jack Kennedy. The evidence Hoover had used to brand her a Nazi spy crumbled upon inspection. The photos with Hitler? They were press opportunities orchestrated by the Reich for propaganda, featuring a naive 20-something journalist who thought she was getting a scoop. The intelligence she supposedly gathered? It was nothing more than the gossip of high society, the kind of chatter that filled every salon in Washington. The investigators found that the woman they had hunted was, in fact, exactly what she had claimed to be, a refugee from a broken Europe, trying to build a life, who had the misfortune of falling in love with a boy who belonged to the state. The release of the files was a posthumous exoneration, but it was a bitter one. It came too late to save her reputation while she lived. It came too late to allow Jack Kennedy to marry her. The injustice laid bare in those 1,200 pages forces us to reevaluate the entire Kennedy mythos. We often view JFK as the master of his own destiny, the cool, detached king of Camelot. But the Arvad files reveal a different man, a man who was, from his very first steps into adulthood, a prisoner. He was trapped by his father's ambition, by Hoover's files, and by a Cold War world that left him no room for nuance. If Inga Arvad serves as a mirror to the 20th century, the reflection she offers is an ugly one. She exposes the misogyny that underpinned the greatest generation. In the eyes of the men who ran the world, Hitler, Hoover, Joe Kennedy, Inga was not a person. She was a symbol. To Hitler, she was the Nordic ideal, a breeding mare for the master race. To Hoover, she was the Mata Hari, a dangerous seductress who used her sexuality as a weapon. To Joe Kennedy, she was a liability, a stain to be scrubbed from the resume. None of them saw the woman who wrote poetry, who raised children, who loved fierce and true. They saw only a projection of their own desires and fears. But perhaps the most profound revelation to emerge from the dust of the archives is the depth of the loss for Jack Kennedy. The transcripts of their hotel room conversations, stripped of the sinister context Hoover tried to impose, are heartbreakingly human. They show a JFK who is unrecognizable from the stiff, pained statesman of the later years. They show a Jack who is vulnerable. With Inga, he didn't have to be the hero. He didn't have to be the heir. He could just be a man in pain, needing comfort. She was perhaps the only person in his life who loved him not for what he could become, but for who he was. We are left to wonder what kind of president he might have been if he had not been forced to sever that part of himself. If he had stayed with Inga, he likely never would have reached the White House. But if he had kept the capacity for that kind of open, vulnerable love, if he hadn't been forced to callous his heart to survive the loss of her, would the decisions he made in the Oval Office have been different? Inga Arvad was his window into the European soul, into the tragic nature of history. She understood the cost of war in a way his Harvard-educated advisors never could. She had looked into the eyes of the monster in Berlin and seen the loneliness there. That wisdom, that nuance was banished from his life along with her. The legacy of Inga Arvad is not found in the history books that list the mistresses of presidents. It is found in the quiet, uncomfortable questions she leaves behind. She challenges the simple narrative of good war and bad guys. She reminds us that in the panic of national security, the first casualty is often the truth, and the second is the human heart. She was a woman crushed between the tectonic plates of history, a flower growing on a battlefield that was trampled by the march of armies. Today, if you search for Inga Arvad, you will find the photos. You will find the black and white image of her sitting in the stadium with Hitler, her smile dazzling and dangerous. And you will find the photos of her with a young, skinny Jack Kennedy, their heads close together, a secret shared between them. These two images, placed side by side, encompass the tragedy of her life. She was the bridge between the darkest darkness and the brightest light of her century. She touched the hand of the devil and the heart of the prince, and in the end, she was destroyed by both. But there is a victory in the fact that we are telling her story now. For decades, the government tried to silence her. The Kennedys tried to erase her. The FBI tried to criminalize her. Yet, she survives. The files that were meant to bury her have instead become her testament. They prove that she was real, that she mattered, and that for one brief shining moment in a darkened world, she was loved. The Nazi spy who seduced a Kennedy is a headline, a tabloid hook. The truth is far more enduring. She was Inga. She was the woman who saw the boy behind the mask. And in the final judgment of history, her crime was not treason. Her crime was simply that she was a woman who dared to live a life too large for the small, frightened men who watched her from the shadows. In the silence of the desert, far from the wiretaps and the whisper campaigns, Inga Arvad finally found her peace. but her ghost still walks the halls of our history, a beautiful blonde specter reminding us that even the most powerful empires are built on the fragile, broken bones of the things we are forced to leave behind.